Here's the thing. The average American home now costs roughly $420,000. The average American earns about $60,000 a year. That means buying a house takes 7 years of your entire gross income. Before taxes, before food, before the internet bill, before literally existing. In 1980, it took about 3 years. And in that same time period, a college degree went from costing something you could pay off with a summer job to costing something you're still paying off at 35. Healthcare premiums tripled in real terms. Car insurance quietly doubled. Egg prices became a political debate. And savings account interest rates spent 15 years at essentially zero, which is the financial system's way of saying your caution is being taxed. Now the response you usually get when you say any of this out loud is, well, stop eating avocado toast. Which is one of the most statistically illiterate things a person can say, but sure. Fine. Skip the toast, you'll be able to afford a house in 412 years instead of 413. So here's the question I want you to actually sit with. If you do everything right, you go to college, you get a stable job, you save responsibly, you don't do anything financially stupid, is the middle class even accessible to you anymore? Because the math is starting to say no. And that's what this video is about. We're going to explain how the middle class was actually built, why the machine that built it has been running in reverse for about 30 years, and why Gen Z is the first generation where doing everything quote-unquote right is no longer enough to land in the middle. That's the thesis. Let's get into it. The central metaphor I want you to hold in your head for this entire video is an escalator, specifically an escalator in a mall. Bear with me. For most of the 20th century, the middle class was an escalator. You didn't have to be exceptional. You didn't have to take risks or build a startup or understand the options market. You just had to get on. Get a decent job, follow the script, and the escalator carried you upward. Stable income, house, retirement, kids if you wanted them, maybe a boat. The escalator moved. And it moved reliably. Now imagine that same escalator, same physical structure, same building, same mall. But someone has quietly reversed the direction. It's now going down. Not dramatically. Not in a way where you'd notice immediately. Just slightly. Just enough that if you stand still, you lose ground. And if you walk at a normal pace, you stay in place. And only if you run, sprint, actually, do you move upward. That's where we are. The escalator didn't disappear. The promise of the middle class didn't vanish overnight. It just changed direction without an announcement. And a lot of people are standing on it right now, confused about why they're not rising because they're doing exactly what their parents told them to do. This is the foundational thing you need to understand before we get into specifics. The middle class was not a natural outcome of capitalism. It was an engineered result of very specific historical conditions. And when those conditions changed, the middle class started to erode. Not because people got lazier, not because culture declined, because the machine was redesigned. Let me walk you through how that actually happened. After World War II, the United States had something almost no other industrialized country had at the time. Functional infrastructure, an intact industrial base, and an educated workforce in a world where most of the competition had just been physically destroyed. Germany was rubble, Japan was rubble, Britain was bankrupt, France was recovering, and the United States was producing 40% of the world's goods. In that environment, even average workers had extraordinary leverage. Companies needed them. Unions had real teeth. Wages grew in direct proportion to productivity. If you made your employer richer, you got richer. That one-to-one relationship is what created the middle class. It wasn't charity, it wasn't good values, it was bargaining power. Then, starting in the 1970s and accelerating through the 80s and 90s, 3 things happened simultaneously. 1. Globalization moved manufacturing to cheaper labor markets, which broke the leverage of the average American worker. 2. The decline of unions removed the collective bargaining infrastructure that had protected wages. 3. Technology started replacing routine cognitive work the way machinery had replaced physical labor, and the escalator started slowing down. But here's where it gets interesting, because from the outside, for a long time, it didn't look like it was slowing down. It looked fine. People were still buying houses. People were still retiring. The American middle class narrative was still intact. Why? 2 reasons. First, debt. Specifically the democratization of consumer credit in the 80s and 90s. People stopped needing wages to grow in order to maintain a middle class lifestyle. They could just borrow against the future, and they did. Massively. Second, 2-income households. In 1960, most middle-class households had 1 income. By 2000, most needed 2. The family had quietly doubled its labor input to maintain the same standard of living. The escalator had slowed by half, so you put 2 people on it, and that worked for a generation. But here's the problem with using debt and dual income as a crutch. You can only borrow so much. You only have 2 adults per household. You run out of buffer. And when you run out of buffer, you're exposed, and that's precisely the situation Gen Z is inheriting. Now, I want to be precise about something because this is where most of the discourse gets sloppy. The middle class is not just a feeling. It's not about values or aesthetics or owning a lawnmower. It's a specific set of financial conditions: stable employment, home ownership, savings accumulation, healthcare access, and the ability to fund your own retirement. That's it. That's the package, and each one of those components is now significantly harder to access than it was 40 years ago, in ways that compound on each other in ways that are not obvious until you do the math. Let's do the math. Consider housing first because it's the most visible and the most misunderstood. People think the housing problem is about prices being high. That's like saying the problem with a broken escalator is that it's tall. The real problem is the ratio. In 1980, the median home price was about 3 times the median household income. That was the historical norm in America for decades. 3 to 1. You could finance that with a conventional mortgage on a single income with some discipline. Today, that ratio is closer to 7 or 8 to 1 nationally. In markets people actually want to live in, the ones with jobs, it's 12, 15, sometimes 20 to 1. And the mortgage payment on a $420,000 home at current interest rates is, depending on your down payment, somewhere between $2,400 and $3,000 a month. On a $60,000 salary, you're taking home maybe $4,000 a month after taxes. You do that math and you find out that the house payment alone is 70% of your take-home income, which is not a budget. That's a financial extinction event. And here's what makes this particularly brutal for Gen Z specifically. Previous generations got to buy in before the price explosion. They got the asset, then the asset appreciated, then they had equity, then they had a cushion. Gen Z is being asked to enter the market after 30 years of appreciation at the top of the curve, with student debt with lower real wages than their parents had at the same age, and with interest rates that have been elevated to cool inflation that wasn't caused by young people buying too many houses. The escalator is going down, and they're being handed the bill for the wear and tear. Now, here's the thing I want to pause on, because I hear the objection forming. The objection sounds like this. Well, people have always complained that housing was too expensive. Every generation thinks they got the worst deal. And that objection is wrong, and it's wrong in a specific measurable way. The price-to-income ratio is not a feeling, it's a number. And that number has roughly doubled in 40 years. You can dispute the implications, but you cannot dispute the arithmetic. Also, something happened between 2020 and 2023 that made this problem permanent in a way it wasn't before. When interest rates were at historic lows, people bought homes and locked in 2.5% or 3% mortgages. Now rates are higher. Those people are not selling. They have no financial incentive to give up a 3% mortgage to buy another home at a 7% mortgage. So supply dried up. Existing homeowners became accidental landlords of their own lives, unwilling to move. And first-time buyers got squeezed into a market with almost no inventory and double the financing costs. The escalator didn't just slow down, it got blocked. Let me move to the second component of the middle-class package, because this one is more insidious and less discussed: the credential trap. Here is the conventional story about education and the middle class. You go to college, you get a degree, the degree gives you access to better jobs pay more, you build a middle class life. Simple, linear, escalator shaped. Here's what actually happened. When the escalator started slowing in the 70s and 80s, people noticed that college graduates were doing better than non-graduates, which was true. But the conclusion they drew, go to college, get ahead, was logically incomplete. Because the reason college graduates were doing better wasn't purely the education. It was partly selection effects, partly credential signaling, and partly that professional class jobs were being protected while working class jobs were being shipped overseas. The degree was a ticket to a protected sector. That's why it worked. Then 2 things happened. First, everyone got the memo. College enrollment exploded. The credential became commoditized. A bachelor's degree in 2026 is roughly what a high school diploma was in 1970. It signals baseline, not excellence. So the return on the credential compressed. Second, the price of the credential exploded in the opposite direction. Between 1980 and today, college tuition has increased by roughly 1,200%, adjusted for inflation. That is not a typo. Healthcare inflation, which everyone agrees is catastrophic, looks modest by comparison. So you have a product that is delivering declining marginal returns and charging exponentially more for access to it. And the mechanism that makes this work, the reason colleges can charge that much, is federal student loans. Because the loans are guaranteed by the government, colleges face no real market pressure. They can charge whatever the loan limits allow. And the loan limits keep going up. This is the textbook definition of a system that is working exactly as designed for the institutions involved and catastrophically for the individual consuming it. Here's a concrete example. Imagine two people. Call them Marcus and David. They're both 22, both smart, both motivated. Marcus takes out $140,000 in student loans to get a degree in communications from a mid-tier private university. His starting salary is $52,000 a year. David goes to a community college for 2 years, gets a certification in HVAC, and starts his own small service operation at 20. By 25, David is clearing $70,000 a year with no debt. Marcus is paying $1,200 a month in loan payments and living with 3 roommates. Now, which of those two is closer to the middle class? The escalator told Marcus to get an education. The escalator was going down. Marcus ran in the right direction on a down escalator and ended up lower than someone who got off. This is not an argument against education. It is an argument that the price of credentials has been decoupled from their value, and that following the conventional script without interrogating the math is now genuinely dangerous. One point that I think gets missed constantly in this conversation: the student loan crisis is not primarily a crisis of individual poor choices. It is a crisis of incentive structures. 18-year-olds were told, consistently and authoritatively by parents, counselors, and the entire culture, that college was the path. The loans were available, the schools were happy to take them, and the consequences were deferred far enough into the future that they didn't feel real. That's not stupidity. That's a system designed to extract maximum value from people before they're old enough to understand what they're agreeing to. Attack the incentives, not the individuals. Alright, if you've made it this far and this is making sense to you, I put out videos like this regularly. If you want to stay in the loop on how money systems actually work, subscribe. There's no pressure. It's just useful if you're someone who's trying to understand the actual game before you play it. Back to the escalator. Here's the third layer of this problem, and this one is the most psychologically interesting to me. It's about what I'm going to call the invisible tax on the middle class. Most people understand inflation as a general problem. Prices go up, purchasing power goes down. But what doesn't get discussed often enough is that inflation hits differently depending on where you are on the wealth spectrum. And it hits the middle class and aspiring middle class particularly hard in ways that the wealthy barely feel and the truly poor get partially compensated for. Let me explain the mechanism. When you have substantial assets, when you own a house, you own stocks, you own a business, inflation is largely neutral to mildly positive for you. Your assets go up in nominal value. Your debt, if you have fixed rate debt, gets repaid in cheaper dollars. Inflation is effectively a wealth transfer from savers and wage earners to asset holders. That's the mechanical reality. Now, who are the savers and wage earners? The middle class. People who earn money by working, spend most of it on living, and save a little in cash or low yield accounts. That's the inflation victim profile. Meanwhile, the wealthy hold assets that inflate with the currency. Their net worth in real terms is relatively protected. And the aspiring middle class, Gen Z specifically, is in the worst position of all. They haven't accumulated the assets yet. They're in the accumulation phase. So they're paying the inflated prices on housing, food, insurance, and education, using wages that have not kept pace with asset price inflation, while trying to save enough to eventually buy into the asset class that would protect them. The escalator is going down. The price of the escalator ticket keeps going up, and the gap between where you get on and where you need to go keeps widening. Here's a number that I find genuinely disturbing. In 1980, the S&P 500's price-to-earnings ratio was around 8. Today, it's closer to 25. That means buying into the stock market, the primary vehicle for middle-class wealth accumulation through 401k plans and index funds, costs roughly 3 times as much per unit of earnings as it did for your parents' generation at the same stage of life. Same escalator, longer ride, Steeper ticket price, more competition for the same seats. And here's the part that I think people don't want to acknowledge. The financial advice that worked for previous generations was optimized for a specific set of conditions. Max out your 401k, invest in index funds, buy a house and hold it. Those strategies produced good outcomes for people who entered those markets when valuations were low and compounding had decades to run. That advice is not wrong, exactly, but its effectiveness has been structurally diminished for someone entering those markets in 2026 at current valuations. It's like telling someone to take the escalator and not mentioning that the direction changed. There's a moment in every video like this where someone in the comments writes, "Okay, but what's the solution?" And I think that's actually the wrong question to start with, because the solution depends entirely on your diagnosis. If you think the problem is individual behavior, people are just spending too much, saving too little, making poor choices, then the solution is self-discipline. Budget better, sacrifice more, stay the course. But if the problem is structural, if the system has been redesigned in ways that make the conventional path mechanically insufficient, then self-discipline solves nothing. You can sprint on a down escalator and still lose ground. The answer isn't to sprint harder. The answer is to understand the escalator and make a different decision about where to stand. So let me give you the fourth and final layer of this, and this is the one that I think is actually the key insight. The middle class was built on labor leverage. That's the core of it. Workers had power because companies needed them and couldn't easily replace them. That leverage produced wages, benefits, stability, and pensions. The entire middle class package was downstream of that one mechanic. That leverage is almost gone, and it's not coming back because the forces that destroyed it, globalization, automation, the gig economy, are not reversing, they're accelerating. What you're seeing now with artificial intelligence is the third wave of labor replacement, and it's hitting sectors that previous waves didn't touch. Knowledge work, creative work, analytical work. The things that college-educated people were supposed to do, the things that were supposed to be safe on the escalator, are now being automated faster than at any point in history. Here's the brutal, honest version of this. The middle class was never really about money in the abstract. It was about a specific relationship between workers and capital in which workers had enough leverage to demand a substantial share of the value they created. That relationship has been fundamentally altered, and no amount of individual hustle restores a structural condition. This is not doomerism. I want to be really clear about that. I'm not saying it's over, give up, go live in the woods. I'm saying the escalator has changed direction, and continuing to behave as though it hasn't is the actual trap. Let me give you the mini case study I want to walk through because I think it makes this concrete in a way that abstract statistics don't. Picture someone named Jordan, 23 years old, graduated 2 years ago with a degree in business administration, $48,000 in student loan debt, current job, project coordinator at a mid-sized company earning $58,000 a year. Lives in a mid-tier city, not New York, not San Francisco, but not rural either. City where the median home price is about $320,000. Let's run Jordan's numbers. Take-home pay after federal taxes, state taxes, and benefits deductions. Roughly $3,700 a month. Rent for a decent one-bedroom, $1,400 to $1,600 a month. Let's call it $1,500. Car payment plus insurance, $450. Student loan minimum payment, $580 a month on a standard repayment plan. Food, utilities, phone, around $600. That leaves roughly $570 a month for everything else: savings, entertainment, clothes, medical copays, car maintenance, life. If Jordan saves that entire $570 every month, in 1 year he has $6,840. To buy a home at $320,000 with a 20% down payment, Jordan needs $64,000 just for the down payment, before closing costs, before repairs, before moving expenses. That's 9.3 years of maximal saving with zero financial emergencies, zero job interruptions, zero unexpected expenses, and no lifestyle beyond the bare minimum. By then, the median home price will likely be higher. The escalator will have gone down further. And this is not an extreme case. This is not someone who made catastrophically bad choices. Jordan got the degree, got the job, is being financially responsible. Jordan is the system working as advertised. And the system as advertised now produces an outcome that is by any objective measure not middle class. The people who run a piece on the internet about how millennials and Gen Z just need to budget better have never actually sat down and done this math. Because if they did, they would find that the math doesn't work. The issue is not the budget. The issue is the denominator. Now, someone will say, well, Jordan could move somewhere cheaper, which is true. There are places where home prices are lower, smaller towns, rural areas, regions with less economic activity. And you can absolutely make that choice. The trade-off is that those areas tend to have fewer opportunities for wage growth, fewer professional networks, fewer career options. You save on housing and you pay for it in career ceiling. The escalator is lower to the ground, but it's also just shorter. Here's a thing that is genuinely funny in a dark way. The official financial advice from most mainstream sources in 2026 is roughly, spend less than you earn, invest the difference, be patient, trust the process. Which is not wrong in a vacuum. That is genuinely how wealth accumulates. The issue is the scale of the gap between what you earn and what you need to spend just to function in a modern economy has grown to a point where spend less than you earn and invest the difference produces for many people about $47 a month going into an index fund. $47 a month at 7% annual returns for 30 years is about $57,000. Which at that point will buy approximately one bathroom tile in the housing market. And the comedic kicker is that this advice is given earnestly, with charts and graphs, by people who bought their houses in 2004. Actually, speaking of mainstream financial advice, imagine a financial influencer in 2015 telling you, just max out your 401k and put it all in the S&P 500. Don't think about it, let it ride. And then you discover that the advice works perfectly. You do get wealthy, but the time horizon to make it meaningful is 40 years. And in 40 years, you'll be 65, and the goal was to have a decent life at 35. Good advice, wrong timeline, escalator going the wrong direction. Here's what I think is the most counterintuitive insight in this entire conversation. And I want to be precise because this gets misread constantly. You might be thinking the problem is that Gen Z isn't making enough money. That's partly true. But I'd push back on the framing because it implies the solution is just to earn more. And while earning more helps everything, it doesn't solve the structural problem if the structure is the problem. The real issue is not income. The real issue is that the asset acquisition window has closed. Or more precisely, it's gotten dramatically harder to enter, more expensive to access, and riskier to attempt at exactly the moment when young people are supposed to be doing it. The middle class was built by people who could acquire income-producing or value-storing assets early in their careers. Homes, pensions, stable equity ownership through company stock plans. Those pathways have either become more expensive, been eliminated, or been replaced with versions that are nominally available but structurally inaccessible given current entry-level economic conditions. The escalator metaphor holds here too. The escalator used to deposit you near the asset ownership floor, now it deposits you below it, and there's a staircase to climb with no handrail and an entry fee. This matters because assets compound. Labor doesn't. If you own a house and it appreciates, you get wealthier while you sleep. If you own index funds, dividends reinvest and the position grows without additional effort. But if your only financial input is your salary, your wealth grows linearly at best, and only when you're actively working. The wealth gap between asset owners and non-owners is not primarily about income. It's about the compounding effect of asset ownership over time. And the gap keeps widening because the people who got in early keep compounding while the people who couldn't get in keep waiting. This is why I find the standard "just work harder" response so analytically frustrating. Work harder to what end? At what conversion rate? If the mechanism that converts labor into asset ownership has been broken, more labor input doesn't fix the conversion mechanism. It just produces more undeployed labor income that gets eaten by a rising cost of living. I want to be honest about something here. Because I'm 20 and technically a millionaire, and I'm aware that makes everything I say about financial difficulty slightly awkward. But the honest version is this. I didn't get here by following the conventional middle-class path. I got here by identifying early that the conventional path was broken and looking for a different one. That's not a brag, that's actually the point of this video. The path isn't gone, but it's different now. And the first step to finding a different path is actually believing that the old one doesn't work the way people say it does. Most people don't believe that yet. They think they just need to execute the conventional plan better, budget tighter, save harder, be more patient, and so they stay on the down escalator, sprinting, wondering why they're losing ground. Here's the framework I'd give you for thinking about this clearly. I think there are three different financial positions you can be in right now as a young person in 2026, and they lead to very different outcomes. The first position is the conventional position. You do what you were told, degree, job, 401k, wait to buy a house, save what's left. If you're in this position, you are on the down escalator, and the outcome depends heavily on factors outside your control. Primarily whether income keeps pace with asset inflation, and whether you're in a professional sector that doesn't get automated in the next 15 years. Some people in this position will be fine. Most will find that fine means working harder than their parents did for a materially smaller outcome. The second position is the escape position. You recognize the escalator problem and you try to get out of it entirely. High income skills, entrepreneurship, freelance leverage, investing in yourself as a productive asset. This is harder than the conventional path, involves genuine risk, and does not come with a script. But the upside is that you're not dependent on a system that's failing. You're creating your own leverage. This is where most of the people I'd call actually wealthy under 30 sit. Not because they were lucky, but because they stopped waiting for a broken escalator to carry them somewhere. The third position is the optimization position. You stay on the conventional path, but you optimize aggressively at every point. You ruthlessly maximize income in high-demand skills. You geo-arbitrage. You make unconventional housing decisions, house hacking, buying in undervalued markets, and working remotely. You deploy every marginal dollar into assets immediately rather than lifestyle inflation. You are essentially running faster than the escalator is going down. This is exhausting. It works for a specific personality type, and it requires almost no luck and almost no margin for error, which makes it fragile. There is no fourth position that involves doing average things and getting middle-class outcomes. That door is closing. The escalator ate it. Now let me close this with the three actual takeaways. Not generic advice, specific structural insights that come directly from understanding the mechanism I've been describing. 1. Stop optimizing for income in isolation. Income without an asset acquisition strategy just produces a higher speed version of the same problem. The goal is not to earn more and spend less. The goal is to convert labor income into assets that compound as early and as aggressively as your risk tolerance allows. Every year you delay entering asset markets, imperfect as they are, overvalued as they may be, is a year of compounding you don't get back. The escalator is not waiting for you to be ready. It's moving now. 2. The credential equation has fundamentally changed and requires a different calculation than the one your parents used. Before you spend money on any education, you need to run three numbers: the total cost, including lost income opportunity, the expected first-year salary in the field, and the realistic salary ceiling in year 10. If the ratio doesn't work, the credential doesn't work. Full stop. This is not anti-education. This is basic return on investment math that the education industry does not want you to apply to its product. 3. Geographic and sectoral arbitrage are probably the highest leverage underutilized tools available to someone in their early 20s right now. The cost of living varies enormously across markets. The ability to earn remotely has never been higher, and entire industries are dramatically undervalued in certain regions. The person who builds a remote income in a high-demand field and lives in a place where assets are still undervalued is the person playing the game on a different board than everyone else. They're not on the down escalator. They found a staircase going up. Here's where we started. Every generation thinks they got the worst deal, but not every generation has the receipts to prove it. Gen Z does. The price-to-income ratio on housing, the cost of credentials relative to their return, the asset valuation entry costs, the wage stagnation in real terms, the automated erosion of professional class job security. These aren't feelings, they're numbers. And the numbers say the escalator is going down. The good news, and I mean this without any motivational inflection because I'm not in the motivation business, is that knowing the escalator is going down is significantly better than not knowing. Most people will keep standing on it, wondering why they're not rising, and adjusting their budget slightly and reading articles about avocado toast. The people who understand the mechanism can make different decisions. And different decisions compounded over a decade produce wildly different outcomes than standing still and waiting for a machine that's broken to fix itself. If you want to stay updated on how to actually navigate these systems, subscribe. It's the most rational next click you can make.